I'm a teacher, and I have been for about 23 years now. I've taught everywhere from kindergarten to freshman year high school. From teaching such a range of kids, they've all had their pros and their cons. The older they were, the more rebellious they were, or the more they talked back. But it was also easier to explain things to them. Younger kids tend to listen better, but then you have to keep in mind that they are younger and less experienced, so sometimes you really have to break things down and even explain simple right and wrong scenarios. Overall, I don't think I had a favorite either way. However, the younger kids really did say the weirdest things. Some of them were funny or nonsensical, others were a bit more alarming. I wanted to share some of the experiences that I still very clearly remember. This occurred when I taught a kindergarten class. Our normal class routine included reading time, where, for an hour, I would read a book while they all sat around and listened. They typically got to choose or vote on the book that they wanted, but I had just bought a story pack of 6 books, so I was reading one from there. I don't remember the exact story. It was one of the short stories in the first book, but there was a talking rabbit that accompanied a young child through a forest after getting lost. No, it wasn't Alice in Wonderland. But now that I think of it, maybe it was a ripoff. Anyway, I tried to engage the kids in the story by asking questions, or letting them ask questions. So there were frequent pauses in reading time, which was fine. There was a boy named Aiden, who was always a very curious child. He asked so many questions, and I always thought that he was just a smart kid. And his curiosity, if he kept it up as he grew up, would take him far. But the questions and comments during this reading time were a bit more morbid. He started by asking, "Does Bunny die in this story?" I thought it was a normal question. Some kids may have experienced death in their own pets, maybe even relatives like grandparents. So I told him no, as I always go over stories before I read them to make sure there are no inappropriate topics in them. Then he asked if the bunny does die, would it go to heaven? I try to steer clear of religion in class for obvious reasons that I shouldn't have to explain. So I just told him that it was a great question, but that I didn't know, and then suggested that he ask his parents. He seemed quite satisfied with the response. After the story was over, he asked, "Do you have any stories where someone dies?" I was taken aback by the question, but just told him no with a raised eyebrow. Reading time finished, and we went back to our normal class curriculum afterwards. Later on, during recess, I saw Aiden sitting in the rocks, not playing, and he seemed like he was holding his knee. He wasn't crying or looking scared, but I was worried that he had injured himself, so I approached him. I asked him if he was okay or if he was hurt, but I noticed that his knee looked fine, but he looked deep in thought. So I asked him what he was thinking about. "I can't wait to see what my bones look like." He said this in such a calm and dreamy sounding voice, like it was a totally normal thing to say out loud. I tried asking him what he meant or why he wanted to see them, and he just said something about how he likes to see plain bones, which is why he likes to eat chicken legs. Then he explained that looking at his knee was as close as he could get to seeing his bones. Surely it had to be innocent. Just a curious young kid, right? Either way, I tried my best to explain that he wouldn't see his own bones, because then that would be a bad thing. And I tried to offer some child-friendly skeleton book. We had a few that went over the structure of the skeleton of humans, as well as some animals. Aiden still said some pretty creepy things like that throughout the year, but thankfully he never took any actions to actually see his bones. Well, at least not in my class. There was another kid in my class named Abigail. It was always Abigail, never Abby. She seemed okay, but just seemed to have issues with making friends. She was always really standoffish, watching others play. I approached her one time and asked her if she was okay and if she wanted to play with them. She said yes, but that her friend would get mad for leaving him. I smiled and told her that her friend was welcome to play too if they were out there. I began looking around, thinking that this friend must have been nearby, and possibly as equally shy as her. But I didn't see anyone else lingering like she would. So I asked her where her friend was. She seemed to look past me and said, "He's right there. It's the Shadow Man." I stood up and quickly turned around, but there was nobody there. Before I got to ask again, she looked down at the ground and said, "He won't let me play with the other kids. He just tells me to do bad things." This thing was obviously causing her problems. Whether it was her imaginary friend and she had the bad thoughts, blaming it on them, or she actually had someone or something following her around. When it comes to the paranormal, I absolutely believe in it. And I believe that kids seem to be more in tune and sensitive to these kinds of things than we are. So I told her that, regardless of who it was, it sounded like a bully, and that if she didn't want to do what it said, or if it made her feel uncomfortable, then she should just say no. A few days after that event, we had a storm, so recess was inside. We were all playing in the play area in the classroom, and I was at my desk, bouncing between paperwork and watching them. I happened to look up at the right time, and I saw Abigail holding a pair of scissors to the back of another girl's head. Out of reflexes, I yelled Abigail's name, which startled all of the kids, and the one that was about to get her hair cut turned around to look at me and saw Abigail. I ran over to them and told them to continue playing, and then asked Abigail what she was doing. Her eyes just looked glossed over, and in her soft little voice she said, "The Shadow Man told me to do it, or he would take me away to his world, where there's no sun, only darkness." What the hell? So I had a heart-to-heart with her, and again explained right from wrong and how she shouldn't listen to this Shadow Man. I ended up writing up a pretty extensive email to her parents about the situation too. They never responded back to me, but I did notice that, slowly, Abigail seemed to turn into a pretty light-hearted and playful girl. Maybe their parents knew more about this Shadow Man than what I knew was there. I have one last story that I'll share for now. There was this boy named Carson, who was in the same class as Abigail, actually. That class was a handful for more reasons than just these two kids. So, Carson seemed to be able to tell the future. I know that it sounds ridiculous, but I still have troubles with it myself. Carson would make these random comments, and I just took it as him being dramatic. For example, he made something during art time and told me that it was for his grandma. I thought it was a sweet gesture, but then he said, "She's gonna fall and break her hip soon." I obviously didn't hear him correctly, and thought he had just said that she had fallen. But no, he corrected me. I said something and he clarified. "No, it hasn't happened yet, but when it does, I will be ready." Okay, a little weird, but I let it go. No point in arguing with a child. About 2 days or so later, his mom came and picked him up early because her mom had fallen and had to be taken to the hospital. She was worried that she wouldn't be home to get him from the bus. Okay, so Grandma did end up breaking her hip. Bizarre, but whatever. But then there were several more times where Carson would seemingly predict the future, and they came true. He mentioned their dog passing away after getting sick. He had seizures, and he died from it. He said his mom was going to get into a car crash. Someone had ran a red light and T-boned her. I became nervous talking to him, fearing that he would have a new prediction and that I would be on edge. We had a birthday party for another kid, and while everyone was enjoying their cupcake, I walked around to make sure all the kids were doing okay, needed a napkin, threw away their trash, and so forth. I stopped by Carson's desk, asking for his trash, and saw him trying to wrap up his cupcake. I asked him what he was doing, if maybe he wasn't hungry, and he shook his head. No, I want to share it with my dad because he's going to die at work tomorrow. That one was pretty intense, as he said it in a very matter-of-fact tone. I stayed calm and collected, and while they enjoyed the little party, I emailed his mom and told her what he had said. We talked briefly as she picked him up that day about it, and she said that it was definitely strange, and that she had witnessed him saying similar things at home. But she always seemed to brush it off like it was just his imagination. I tried to match that with her, not wanting her to think the teacher was crazy, but come on. Not once did he predict correctly, but multiple times. I just prayed that one wouldn't come true, and thankfully, throughout the school year, Dad never died. Hopefully that one was just his imagination. When I remember Carson, I often wonder if he still makes predictions like that. So, there are a few kids that scared me as a grown adult. I love teaching, and still do today, but sometimes, kids can unintentionally be pretty unsettling. I just have to remember that they're kids, though. It's not like they're intentionally trying to scare me, right? I have plenty more stories about these things that kids have said or done. I'm fairly new to your channel, so if your audience likes them, I will happily write up some more for you. Me and my boyfriend were playing video games in our bedroom on my birthday 5 nights ago, for probably an hour or so. He was on our bed playing Xbox, I was on the PC, not even a foot away. When we finally got off the game, we both took our headphones off, and he looks at me saying, "Do you want to smoke a bowl?" I respond with yes, and joined him on our bed. Around 10 seconds after he initially asked to smoke, he went to grab his phone, and I was just looking at him. Then a female-sounding voice, maybe me, clear as day, said, "Can we take a bowl?" I wasn't expecting to hear my own voice, so I still don't know if I'm trying to think it wasn't, but we both heard it. It was only a few words off from what my boyfriend said, so we first thought maybe a recording, hacker, device relay, Alexa, cops. We truly have been over everything, and it's a dead end every time. It was a completely different sentence altogether, so we got over that option very quickly. My boyfriend had never believed in any type of alternative universe before, but it's the only logical conclusion. We're both convinced this was a glitch, and in some other timeline, I said that to him instead. It's happened way too many times. Me saying that exact phrase and exact scenario, even in the same tone. Was this maybe my past best friend visiting me on my birthday, legit wanting to smoke with us? A mimic? A ghost? We both got immediate chills and left the house to my parents. I was hotter than I've ever been in my life the whole night, with sweat beading down my face, and was calm as day hours later. I woke up to a horrible dream of me and my boyfriend in our own bed at home. And in the dream, I woke up, rushed to the end of the bed, to see a demon figure. And before I could even react, I was awake. Another thing, maybe related or not, we just moved into this house 4 months ago. Ever since, I have been feeling so drained. No energy. My mood has been erratic at times. Maybe I'm vulnerable. I'm so lost right now, but trying to stay positive. I also want to say that no, we were not just intoxicated or whatever. We didn't even get our ball because it spooked us so bad. We do have carbon monoxide detectors in every single room in our house. They are on and working and have been thoroughly checked. I appreciate the concerns, but unfortunately that's not our problem. So let me know what you think. Glitch, ghost, mimic, loved one? Any feedback is appreciated. Edit. Fast forward to 2 days later. My boyfriend and I have to fly across the country to visit my family. We tried to put this out of our minds the best we could. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll ever live my life the same. I finally let my guard down and thought to myself, nothing can come with me. I'm safe. That wasn't until we saw them. My boyfriend points out an older lady. Very witch-like, you know. The kind that you see and just know they have too much knowledge. But right in front of her, I pointed out a man. A spitting image of a demon in human form. He had leather and chains and a cloak/cape, dressed in black from head to toe, senpaku eyes, very violent looking. He's only staring at me, in my eyes. I can literally feel it after I looked away. Not just him though, witchy too, until they had to physically turn their heads to continue looking into me. Spooky enough, right? Well, just get this freaking mind flip. My boyfriend didn't see the guy. Now, you tell me how in the world he sees this witchy older lady staring at me 2 feet away from the man in front of her and doesn't see him. Once we shared our concerns and agreed that that was not normal, I realized I could just be losing my mind, or I'm being watched. The next day, we're out to dinner with my family, and I go to use the restroom. I was hesitant because it was scary to me and dark, and I just didn't want to be alone, not even to go. I heard my boyfriend joking with my family about how I was scared. So, of course, I thought he was the one who came up to the bathroom door and said, "Psst," but he wasn't. The first time back to the house after our trip, and the garage door opened for us. We ruled out the roommates, they were all upstairs. Electrical problems, everything's working fine and has been checked, and our garage clicker was in the glove compartment. Impossible for us to have bumped it or accidentally pressed it. As soon as we rolled into the driveway, it started opening. If that isn't the biggest, "come on in," I don't know what is. Firstly, to start this story off, potential trigger warning as this includes an attempted essay encounter. If you don't want to listen to anything involving that, I recommend skipping this story. So, this might be a bit overdue to be told, and if you choose not to use it, I don't blame you. Even to me, a lot of this story feels like some mix of a fever dream and a really, really bad acid trip. A big part of me is reluctant to even tell it, but then something in my soul says that I should. That being said, let's just do it quick, like a band-aid. I'm male, now 39, was 38 when this story occurred, and last March, 2023 for posterity's sake, the woman that I had been with for nearly 5 years dragged me off to Kissimmee, Florida to form a throuple with a guy we had been friends with for about 2 years. Yeah, even I heard it as I'm typing it out. Why would you ever do something that stupid, you ask? Well, because I loved her, and I wanted her to be happy. Even if it meant doing something as stupid as going to a place like Osceola County, Florida. But already I digress. Once we actually made the 1,100-mile drive, the crap show began. Immediately, I was iced out by my ex and her new boy toy. And yeah, that's the nicest way that I'll ever address him. And I found myself alone in a place that was kind of like my own personal hell. Day 4 of being there, and the ex and myself were at an Airbnb hosted by an ex-crackhead, when my ex decided that at 6:30 a.m., she wanted to start the stupidest domestic in the history of domestics. Now, by this point, a lot of other stuff had been going on before we got to Florida, and I'll summarize it as I was exhausted mentally and physically. I was sleep-deprived, and in the middle of a bit of a mental health crisis pertaining to the anniversary of my mother passing. So this logic loop of an argument stretched from 6:30 a.m. until 10:30 a.m. I'm staying as calm as I can in the circumstances, while my ex was acting like a lunatic, flailing and kicking the bed, tearing at her hair while screeching that I was acting like a lunatic. For me, it felt like reality was breaking. I could barely think, and I had to get out of there and give us both a chance to calm down. I told her that I was going for a walk and that I would be back later. She screams that she would die before she let me leave. Yeah, not a red flag at all. And when I went towards the door, she grabbed my pants and yanked them to my knees. I got them pulled up, and I left anyway. I walked a few blocks away to a park and sat chain-smoking cigarettes until I calmed down. All I had was my wallet, and my last few cigarettes. I didn't even have my cell phone, as my ex had it and her phone both. I was a mess. My long hair disheveled and unbrushed, face red and tear-stained, wearing some raggedy old sleep pants. I usually would have never worn those out of the house. And clearly there were signs that I was in distress. And so I start walking back to the B&B when 2 Osceola County deputy cars rock up on me with lights and sirens going. Either my ex or B&B host had called in that I was a danger to either myself or others, and I was put into handcuffs for the first time in my life, and then hauled into a crisis center on the Baker Act. That's an involuntary 72-hour hold. Now, this is where the encounter with a Hispanic fellow named Pablito happens. Late in the afternoon of day 2 of my hold, I go into one of the bathrooms. Apparently the lock on the door was messed up because, as I finished my business, the door just opened enough for Pablito to slip in. Which, trigger warning here. He grabbed me from behind and started saying some of the most disgusting things I've ever heard, and will not repeat. And then he started trying to get handsy. Luckily, one of the staff had seen Pablito go into the bathroom before I had come out, and the guy busts into the bathroom with 2 big Haitian orderlies. I drove the back of my head into Pablito's face and got out the door, and all I hear are the orderlies talking crap as they proceed to boot my freaking assailant. Pablito leaves in handcuffs, looking like he just went 12 rounds with Iron Mike. And the rest of my time there passes, and the next evening I'm released. My ex and her boy toy pick me up and take me to the motel they had relocated to. As I tell them the story, they both laugh. Yes, you are not going crazy. When I said that he grabbed me and started trying to grope me, they laughed. I let that go, and everyone goes to sleep. The next morning, the boy toy goes to work, and the ex and I go to have a talk, where she friend-zoned me after 5 years. 48 hours later, I was sleeping on bus benches around the Saralago Hotel for another 2 days, before I was able to get a bus back to Missouri. And that, Miraza, is the second most effed up story I could possibly tell you from my life experience. Looking back on it, all I can think is, this is why you never go to Florida. Since I've been back, I heard at least 3 other stories about people going to Florida in a couple, and one of them being dumped and in similar circumstances to me. So, if your SO tries to talk you into a trip to Florida, maybe start wondering what their motives are. It could be a new red flag to keep an eye out for. Holds up sarcasm sign. Thanks, Raven, for being amazing for one, and for taking the time to read this, even if you don't put it in a video. Love you, love everyone hearing this, and remember, They screw you at the drive-thru. A few years ago, my partner Jay and I were living in Oregon. There were hot springs that we wanted to go to for some time, about a 2-hour drive from us up in the mountains. In the late summer of 2021, we decided to drive up there, but it was forest fire season, and in the Pacific Northwest, the sky gets choked with smoke almost every August and September, even if you're hundreds of miles away from an active fire. Unfortunately, as we increased in elevation towards the hot springs, the air became so choked with smoke that we felt ill, and we decided to turn back and go home disappointed. The following spring, we decided to try again. We made the drive out to the hot spring, only to find that the road up there had been closed for a landslide a few days previously. We were super frustrated, and decided to just go for a hike nearby since we had driven all that way, and then went home. A few months later, we made plans again to try to get out to the hot springs with our close friends, but they both bailed last minute, and we decided to not go. By this point, getting to these hot springs began to feel like a vendetta, or a curse. We would occasionally joke that we had to get to them eventually to either fulfill our karmic purpose or die. Mostly joking. Finally, in February of 2023, we made plans with several friends from around the state to rent a cabin next to the hot springs for 2 nights and go for a winter soak. Hot springs in the snow are divine as hell, if you've never been. Jay and I, and our friend Allie, drove down together and got to the cabin a few hours before anyone else was set to arrive. Eventually, there would be 7 of us total. Now, my first impression of the cabin was excitement, mixed with mild unease. We were pretty far out in the woods, with 2 abandoned-looking cabins next to ours. The cabin was built by the CCC in the 1930s, so it just had a classically old and creepy feeling. We all agreed that it was a little spooky, but in a light-hearted way. Since we were there before the other friends, we got to pick our beds first. Allie was the only person coming who wasn't part of a couple. She only knew Jay and I, and she was younger than everyone else. So Jay and I felt like we wanted to stick close to her and make sure she was feeling comfortable. Because of this, we decided to leave the 2 bedrooms downstairs for the 2 other couples, and Jay, Allie, and I would take the loft, which had 4 single beds. Sort of like a summer camp vibe. We unpacked our stuff and decided to go to the hot springs for a few hours while we waited for the other friends to arrive. We went to the hot springs, which was amazing, and then drove back at night through the snow to get back to the cabin. By this time, everyone else had gotten there. We greeted each other and had a very merry evening, made dinner, played games, and danced. Before we went to bed, my friend Summer mentioned to me that when she and her partner got there, she'd heard footsteps upstairs. She'd asked if we'd all been at the hot springs the whole time, which we had. Spooky, but we all giggled about it. We all went to bed late and a little drunk. That night, Jay and I pushed our twin beds together because we like to snuggle. Normally we sleep together great, but being in the loft, it got unbearably hot, even in the middle of February with only a wood stove. I had weird dreams because of the heat and did not feel well rested in the morning. Regardless, the next day we spent the whole day soaking at the springs and having a really great time. In the evening, we returned to the cabin and made a big dinner and spent the evening playing games and occasionally stepping into the back porch for a cigarette. The back porch was dimly lit with a single light bulb, and it opened up onto a backyard ringed by an old stone wall. Behind the stone wall was a rushing river. The yard was full of old scrap metal. This will be relevant later. Anyway, that night we went to bed late. Jay and Allie and I in the loft once again. As we were about to fall asleep, Allie said anxiously, "Did anyone lock the door?" None of us had. Jay, in character, said, "I'll go lock it." Uncharacteristically, Allie sat straight upright and said, "No, I'll go do it." Being the group baby, it seemed out of character for her to volunteer to get out of bed, go all the way downstairs alone in a creepy cabin and lock the door. But she did. She came back up and got in bed, and we all went to sleep. Or attempted to. Once again, it was boiling hot, and I really just had the heebie-jeebies. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to the sound of someone tapping on the window. It's just a branch, I told myself over and over. I drifted in and out of foggy nightmares, waking with a start at the slightest noise. Somewhere in the night, I realized that Jay was awake too. I really had to pee, but was too scared to go downstairs alone, so I tapped him on the shoulder and asked if he'd come down with me. He was also feeling freaked out and had to go, so we codependently held hands down the stairs and went to the bathroom together like scared little kids. James is a fairly heavy smoker, and he wanted to have a smoke to calm himself down and help him sleep. For some reason, I felt as though I couldn't let him go outside alone. Like something terrible would happen if I didn't go with him. So I accompanied him through the kitchen. When I saw the clock, it read 3 a.m., and we went out to the back porch, where we both stood for a few minutes in silence, before getting mutually freaked out and rushing back inside. I, very paranoidly, double-checked that the back door was locked after we came in. We then went back upstairs and got back into bed. I laid down, and I'm immediately starting to have wild visions. In my vision, I saw Jay get out of bed and walk out onto the back porch. There he slipped on the wood, fell to the ground, and hit his head on a metal pole, which went through his skull and killed him. This was so disturbing that I had to open my eyes. But every time I closed my eyes again, I would see the same thing happen. Back porch, slip, die. Back porch, slip, die. Eventually, I fell into a sweaty and fitful sleep. In the morning, we were gathered around the kitchen table, and I mentioned that the night had just been terribly uneasy. Jay then looked at me and said something that chilled me to the bone. After we came back from smoking last night, I had this feeling like I was being drawn outside by something. Like I couldn't stay in bed, and I wanted to go back outside on the porch. As I was falling asleep, I had this incredibly vivid vision that I went out onto the back porch and saw these piles of raw meat in the yard, stacked up almost like a sacrifice. And it really felt like it was human flesh. It felt like something was trying to get me to go out there so that it could eat me. My mouth fell open. I was about to tell him about my vision of his death on the back porch when Allie spoke up. "That's so weird, Jay. Last night when you offered to go down to lock the door, I felt like I had to stop you and go down there to lock it myself instead. It felt like if you went down there by yourself, you would have been lured outside by something." I chimed in. "Allie, that was the exact feeling I had too, when I didn't want to let him go outside to smoke by himself." I told them both about my vision of Jay slipping and dying. We were all shaken as hell, and couldn't stop discussing it over breakfast. We all agreed that whatever it was had very dark feminine energy, in the vein of sirens or selkies, and that it had latched on to Jay as a sacrifice. We left the cabin after breakfast, and we got home just fine. I can't help thinking about our running joke about the hot springs being cursed for us. But maybe the hot springs were trying to warn Jay to stay away. And maybe next time we'll listen when something rejects us 3 times in a row. My twin sister, Erin, had owned her home for quite some time now, but had recently gotten a divorce. I won't go into those messy details, but because of his actions and the settlement, she got the house. However, she had never been the gardening and yard work type. Her now ex usually took care of that, and they had very little decor or even variety because of it. However, once he was gone, it was all up to her. Sometimes, if I was free, I would go over and mow for her, but being a full-time dad and husband, and not to mention working myself, I didn't have a lot of free time. So she ended up looking up gardeners and landscapers for hire. She started paying to have someone mow and de-weed every other week. She did have a small yard and was planning on having a small decorative garden put in, like bushes and hardy plants, and things that she didn't have to worry about dying easily, knowing her. One day, I had to drop something off for her, and her gardener was there, putting in the raised bed. She introduced me to him. I'll call him Jack, and she explained how he was very thorough and had a deep knowledge of plants. She said that she was thankful for him because he helped her choose what plants would be best for her yard, based on how much sun it would get and the type of soil that she had. He had on a collared shirt with a logo on it, and he was very polite, so at first glance, he seemed professional and kind enough. I mean, he was just helping with the yard and the plants, thinking he can't really go wrong there, right? The following week, I found myself ending up at Erin's place a few times because of things that brought us together. I had to drop off something she was borrowing, pick up her laptop, and try to fix it. And she even watched my 2 kids when my wife and I took her mom to the hospital for surgery. Every time I was there, Jack was also present. He was always out in the yard, and the first few times, nothing seemed strange. He was just working on the garden. But by the 3rd time, and me not seeing that much had changed, I asked Erin about it. She said that Jack had troubles finding the plants because the ones that he got were in poor shape or looked already dead, so it was delaying him. As mentioned, she knew very little about plants, so I asked her if she saw the plants and if she was paying for them all because I was worried that he may have been doing it just to charge her more. She claimed that she asked about that too, and he said that he wasn't, that it was his fault for not checking them first. So I just told her to keep track of how long it took, worried that maybe he would try to charge more for the labor. I know that that was probably wrong of me, I admit, but it was something that happens with some small contractors, so it was a legit concern. However, Erin did not like to look helpless or naive, so I knew when it was time to let it go, and that's what I did. I didn't ask much about it after that, and just anticipated seeing her garden once it was done, and seeing how happy my sister would be. Anyway, after seeing Erin several times that week, I didn't see nor talk to her much the following week. Sometimes we would text sporadically, but I had been really busy, so our chat fell pretty silent. However, I was working from home on Friday, and my wife went to a friend's for a playdate with the kids, so I had the house all to myself. After living with kids for 6 years, the house is way too quiet when they're gone, so I decided I would surprise my sister with lunch. She didn't work on Fridays, so I assumed that she would be home. I called her, and when she didn't answer, I just decided to go over there first. I sent her a text to let her know I was on my way at least, and I headed out. When I pulled up, I didn't see her car, but she did have a garage, so it could have been in there. And she typically parked in the garage unless she was in a rush. I checked my phone before I got out and frowned when I saw that I had no missed calls and no reply to my text. It was unusual for Erin to go so long without responding, so I found it odd. But maybe she was busy, or just didn't have her phone on her. But when I approached the door, that's when my stomach dropped. The door was sitting slightly ajar. Erin would never forget to close her door. I knew that something was wrong, so I called 911, but I dropped my phone in my pocket. I slowly walked in and looked around the dark and quiet room. There was no movement, but the air seemed tense. I was immediately put into fight or flight mode. I walked partially to the right to check the kitchen, but it was empty. So I started walking towards the hall to the back. The hall led to stairs on the left that goes up to the bedrooms, and to the right was a mudroom and office, including a door that led to the backyard. I slowly walked down the hall and leaned over to check in the mudroom, and it was empty. Lastly, I had to check upstairs. As soon as I turned to go upstairs, I looked up and saw a dark figure of a man staring down at me from the top of the stairs. I said something along the lines of, "Oh crap," and before I could process anything, the man came running down the stairs at me, full speed, like I was about to be charged. My first reaction was to be on guard, so I put myself in that stance. The guy pushed me back, causing me to fall into the mudroom. He nearly jumped over me and ran out the back door. I yelled out to the man to stop and chased after him. He'd gotten pretty far ahead, but I knew who it was as I watched him run away. It was Jack, no doubts. He was even in one of the same collared shirts. I stood in place knowing that there was no way I would catch him until I heard Erin yelling my name. I started walking back towards the house where I saw Erin standing in the doorway, holding my phone to her ear. I had forgotten that I even called 911, so she was talking to them and trying to ask me what was going on. She had on sweatpants and an old shirt. Was she asleep? I wondered. I told her what had happened, and she handed the phone back to me for me to explain it to them. I followed Erin back to the front, where a cop was also standing and asking her questions. Everything kind of melded together at that point. Erin said that she had a migraine, so she went upstairs to take a nap. She didn't wake up to my call, or text, until she heard me yelling downstairs. I gave a full description of Jack, so did Erin, and I confirmed that it was him, without a doubt. The color of Erin's face was gone, as I explained what I saw. She confirmed that not only did he not have any reason to be in her home, but he had no reason to be there at all. He had completed the work earlier that week. I didn't want to think about what his intentions were. Luckily, they were able to find him, and he was arrested. You see, I was under the impression that Erin had done research on the company, or person, she hired. As in, looked at reviews and such. But, in actuality, she only did her review based on the conversation and quote she got from him at the time of the meeting. After looking at the company itself, I learned a lot. He was supposedly the owner of this small local company, and many reviews I saw talked about how the guy seemed very nosy. He would ask to use their bathroom, and when he didn't return for several minutes, he would be found looking around their home. Some of them said that it was just suspicious. Some of them said that things went missing, but they couldn't prove that it was him. After our experience, I could believe it. This guy may not have adjusted his prices, but it seemed like he just took what he wanted in return. Thankfully, Erin didn't find anything missing or out of order, so I may have stopped him before he was able to take anything. I just try not to think about what could have happened if he saw her in the room alone. From that day on, Erin is a lot more cautious when it comes to looking for hired help. She now understands how crucial it is to do those checks and reviews before making a decision. Now, I just have to get past the fear that something could be wrong when she doesn't respond to my calls or texts immediately. Raised Catholic, we were told that each person has a guardian angel to protect them from harm. As the Bible mentions, God is in the whispering of the wind. A small voice, not a thunderous one. So, 1. I was not even in kindergarten yet, so I would say that I must have been 4. My sister, 9, and I shared a bedroom then with our parents' room across the hall from us. The third bedroom was called the music room, and it had a record player and a huge collection of old and new music on 78 RPM records, 33, and so on. A TV, a radio, and a couch, and a little metal TV table that we would draw or color at and do art. My dad was working, and my mother went to answer the phone. It was her younger sister, our aunt. I heard her say, "Catherine, a storm is coming, so I'm not staying on here long." Suddenly, my sister and I still recall vividly. We were silently and swiftly moving to the doorway of that room and turned around completely to be facing into the room. We had been at that tiny metal table working. She and I were placed gently into a standing position, now looking in the room. We screamed in confusion and fright. Mother came running to us, and we could barely explain it, but we both said it was a guardian angel that we couldn't see. A bolt of lightning struck, and the thunder was deafening just after we were moved. Story 2. Later, when grown, I was helping an elderly family friend. We had been in and out, and winter weather had come in, making a dangerous freezing rain and thick ice coating trees and streets and power lines. Kentucky gets these, and they're like a fairyland by day, but by night, it's black ice from hell. I worried as I could barely walk over the stuff myself to his car, and gingerly hoisted him up on his feet. He was in his 80s, and I prayed that I could get him into his front door safely. I parked close, but at the same point, I knew we were in trouble. That railing on the porch was too far from us, and suddenly, I felt uplifting, gliding, or reverse magnetism or something, and effortlessly we went forward without any friction. He grabbed the rail when he could, and we ascended the icy steps with caution. He unlocked his door, and we went inside, slipping off our shoes, and sat in perfect silence. Then, he broke it. "Did you feel that?" I said yes, I did. I said, "What was that, and how?" He then said, "A guardian angel. I prayed for help." I said that I did too. We could never forget this. Story 3. I was walking across a store parking lot going towards my mother's car as I went to school on the public bus. "There she is," I noted. I had a huge pile of books, as usual. In a stride towards her car, a mental tiny voice said, "Stop right where you are. Not one more step." I thought it was weird, but I stopped. Then some horrendous noise sounded loudly. A giant section of pavement patch had been pulled up into the wheel well of the bus, became stuck, and then catapulted to the side. And as Mother watched me, she saw me walking, a huge flying rock hurtle into the air, and then I just stopped in my stride. It hit the pavement so hard and was less than a foot from the toe of my shoe. Finally, entering her car, she kept saying, "What made you stop?" Story 4. I was grocery shopping for our old neighbor/friend at Kroger. I had gone 2 weeks prior and had been followed and intimidated by someone trying to rob me, I suppose. 2 weeks later, I went to a different Kroger, and again, I was followed all around that store. He didn't have any baskets, and he was huge tall, and I'm a 5-foot tall woman with a fully loaded basket leaving the store, fully aware of him following me. Now, I checked out, and in an aisle, leaving, I heard that small voice. "Look over your left shoulder." I turned my neck around while still briskly walking, but to my surprise, he had accelerated so much that he was in a definite collision course with me. I sidestepped one big scissor step to my right, leaving the basket, and then, bang, the stalker rammed into the cart, and I stepped back to it as he hurried out, then grabbing a cart and running back into the store. When you hear the voice, harden not your heart, and Buster, move. Story 5. I was at Broadway downtown at midnight. At this point, I worked second shift at a downtown hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. I left the parking garage at midnight, and the street was deserted that night, and I was caught at Preston Street by a light and stopped. Something in my mind said not to pull up to the crosswalk, but to stay a car length back, and I had done it. I looked over the 6 lanes. Empty. Quiet. But I felt creepy. Then, a spooky-looking character pulled up and eyed me, but I wouldn't look over. I knew better. The voice said when the light changes, don't go for a couple of seconds. The guy had tried to make eye contact, but pulled up more quickly, and since I was further back, he moved up. I felt relief. The light changed, and I waited. He waited as if to go when I did, so I waited a second more. He then gunned his throaty car forward, giving up on me and moving on. When a car from the street crossing on my right, Preston Street, slammed into him as he moved forward, throwing his heavy car across 3 lanes, then way up onto the sidewalk, only to land when hitting a big brick building. So, yeah. Always heed the little voice, and never reason that it's just your imagination. So, I'm a pretty vivid dreamer, and I can remember most of my dreams. They're like mini movies, and I've had like 2 or 3 nightmares in my 36 years of life that I'm aware of. This is the first dream I've had where I legit died. I'll try not to ramble. Dream takes place in a stereotypical suburban neighborhood with 1-story houses, not my current 2-story apartment complex. My next-door neighbor has done something awful, and the neighbor across saw it. The sheriff tried to intimidate her not to testify. I guess he was in on it. I was helping her in her front yard and overheard everything. A detective from the city came by and started talking to me about the incident and the sheriff. At that moment, the sheriff stepped out and the detective started talking to him. As I walked away, I could feel the sheriff staring daggers at me, and I felt someone else staring at me, but I couldn't see them. So I quickly went back to my house. As I was settling down for a night of working at home on my couch, I don't do this in real life, I decided to close my blinds all the way because of the ominous feeling I had in the street earlier. As I was closing the blinds, I glanced out to scan the streets, and then bam! Something hit me in the forehead, and I was out. Everything went black. As I slowly woke up, it felt like a minute or two, the center of my forehead hurt a lot. I was trying to run through what had happened. Was I standing too close to the window and hit my head? Did something outside the window and hit it, and it somehow hit me? As I was thinking this, I realized the lamp I had on was off, and I was lying on the air mattress I sometimes used instead of on the floor. Again, not in real life. Slowly turning my head, eyes half open, I look towards my window and I see the orange glow of the streetlight and a dark silhouette just above me. Before I could focus on what I was seeing, there was another movement and a loud bang. I jerked my eyes closed. My right ear was ringing. What just happened? Was I just shot? I felt warm liquid pooling under my thigh and butt. My forehead still hurt and my ear was still ringing, but nothing else. I didn't feel any pain. Maybe it wasn't me. I remember feeling the warmth of my dog next to me. Oh my god, did they shoot on her? Or was it me? Another shot, and I felt my bladder release. It was weird. They just shot me. Was I murdered? Did someone just murder me? Why? And who? Was it the sheriff? I don't think so. The silhouette wasn't fat enough. But oh my god, I was just murdered. I thought all of this as the blackness became blacker around the edges and shrank in like the black screen at the end of Looney Tunes. It's the only way I can think to describe it. And then as it closed, I woke up. I was just murdered. I was very confused for a second. I could still feel the echoes of pain in my forehead and my right ear ringing. No actual pain or ringing though, just kind of a sensory memory that it happened. I felt like I had legit died. I did a run-through of my apartment, lights, locks, closets, all the checks. And after that, I started to think, what if I just witnessed the death of a parallel me? I mean, oh my god, it really freaked me out, because it felt so real. And not just the pain, but the atmosphere of, oh crap, there's something wrong. A seriously wrong atmosphere. Usually if I dream of something, I'm me for like the first few seconds, and then turn into someone else when it gets serious and actiony. But this was the first time that I was me the whole time. Sorry for the long post, I tried to keep it to the relevant bits. Like I said, I dream in full-on movies. Sometimes commercials. So, what do you guys think? Did I just experience the death of a parallel me? I've shared some experiences on here. If you'd like to read some of my past posts on the topic, you can just look at my history on here. I can't remember if it was on this subreddit or not. Anyhow, I've been trying to compile my experiences in a way where I can follow the breadcrumbs. To be honest, sometimes I just don't want to think about it because I think I sound crazy, or might be losing my mind. There are moments when I'm more inclined to share my experiences, and then there are moments when I think about if someone wanted to, they could use all this against me. Isn't that what happens to people who live or think outside of the box? Outside of the norm? We aren't able to meet outside of the fringes of society. Anyhow, over the last few years, I've been having experiences where there is two-way communication going on. There were times, especially when it started happening, where I was communicating with myself, but it obviously wasn't me. It was someone that appeared to have the exact same DNA and genetic makeup as me, but it was from another reality. It would be in the form of a daydream. That's the best way I can describe it. It would happen when my guard was down. In other words, my mental capacities were not as rigid or attached to my perceived reality or senses. I know this might sound counterintuitive, but I believe that more of us would have these experiences if we weren't so attached to the physical world around us, including our own perceived reality. No, I wasn't high or tripping, although I do believe that some psychedelics may aid in prepping the human mind to experience these connections. I just don't think they are necessary. I think the human mind can attain these levels of awareness and communication without the use of external substances. These moments would usually happen late in the day, when I would be tired. Not to the point of falling asleep, but tired. These weren't dreams, either. Yes, I have had dreams where I believe they are an extension of other realities, but what I'm specifically talking about right now is about communicating with other realities. These were never initiated by myself, to my knowledge. There would be moments where I would be talking, and I would see who I was talking to, and they would ask me a question, and then my vision would return to what was right in front of me, and I'm answering out loud that question that was asked to me seconds before. I don't think that it was astral projecting. I think my whole self was in the physical, literal spot in my reality where these encounters took place. But I think the other realities have the technology to communicate with other realities, and they somehow meet them where they are at. I apologize if any of this is confusing, and I understand if you have written me off as a raving lunatic. I wouldn't blame you. I'm just trying to see if there are others who have had similar experiences. There were times where it seemed that I was communicating at once with 3 different realities. Then I stopped having communication with what seemed to be my others from alternate universes. It then started shifting to where I was communicating with people I had never seen before in my life, and it looked like they were wearing attire from the 1940s or 50s. I know that sounds cliche, but that is the best way that I can describe this. It was a group of 3 people. One person was sitting at a desk, and they had what looked like an old Walkman, headphones around the temples of their head, and 2 people, a man and a woman, would be standing behind them. I got the impression that it was the person sitting down with the headphones on the side of their head that was doing the communicating. Then I got a glimpse where it was a room full of these groups of 3 people. In other words, an auditorium-sized room, full of desks, where one person was sitting down and there were 2 behind them. I moved to a new town about 2 months ago, and these experiences and encounters have stopped. I am a veteran and got blown up twice when I was in Iraq. And so, through the VA, I was able to get my head checked in more way than one, because I was honestly concerned something was wrong. And nothing problematic nor concerning has shown itself. There are so many theories I have about all this, but that's all they are. If there is technology that other realities have, there's no telling what year they are in. Just because we are in the 2020s doesn't mean that another reality is. There might be something to have someone with the same genetic makeup and the same DNA being able to communicate with their others in another reality. The more I try to figure it out, I just find myself with more questions. I appreciate this subreddit. When I read other people's experiences, it encourages me to press forward. I'm open to hearing if anyone else has had anything similar happen to them, or to hear their ideas and thoughts on the matter. This took place about 15 years ago. I, an adult male, entered into a restaurant that featured a pizza buffet, where you can select slices from a variety of different pies. There was also a pasta and salad bar as well. I paid the buffet price and grabbed 2 plates, then selected multiple slices of pizza and placed them on one of them. Once that plate was full, I went and sat down at an available table. As I sat, I set aside the empty plate on the table with the intent of using it at the salad bar later. I had been eating for a few minutes when then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the empty plate start to move. Instincts immediately took over and I slammed my hand down on the plate with a loud bang. I looked up and was staring into the face of one of the servers, a female, probably in her late teens. She stood there frozen with a look of complete shock on her face, still holding on to the plate. I can't say for sure what my expression was, but I'm guessing it was a blank stare because I felt nothing but absolute calmness at that moment. I then slowly whispered to her the words, "I'm not done with that." The girl remained frozen for a few more seconds, doing everything she could to keep from screaming before uttering, You're not done with that?" I was still feeling completely calm. No anger, rage, anxiety, or anything. I then again whispered, "No, sorry." She then cautiously released the plate and slinked away. Now, was I aware of what I had just done? Yes, I was. However, my thinking at that moment was, well, she deserved that. She shouldn't have been trying to steal stuff from my table. Maybe next time she'll have the common courtesy to ask first. But in the years that have followed, I've come to realize that I was in the wrong, and she did not deserve any of that. I sincerely hope that she's forgiven me by now, and was not scarred for life by my actions. I've been babysitting since I was allowed to be home alone. I babysat my own siblings, and when my mind understood that I could continue to do what I normally do, with some authority and get paid for it, I offered to babysit any chance that I could. Maybe it was being around so many kids, but it also made me realize how much I loved kids, and how well I can work with them. It's actually the reason I went to college for children's psychology. While I went to school, I continued to babysit, house sit, or pet sit wherever I could. It was basically my job. I was lucky enough that my parents helped me buy an apartment so I could focus on schooling and continue doing what I loved. However, there were some sitting jobs that I would end up quitting, or had quite the lasting memories of, good and bad. Cecily was one of those unforgettable jobs. Cecily was an 8-year-old girl. Her parents found me on a babysitting website. I had listed myself and had tons of reviews, so it was normal for people to find me that way. Cecily's mom was a full-time caretaker. She basically took care of those in hospice, but from their home, so she couldn't take Cecily with her, understandably. And Dad was a police officer. Definitely not the place for her either. They needed someone to watch her on days that daycare didn't align with Mom's schedule. Dad was practically always on call, so he couldn't watch her alone. So they had 2 days they specifically needed me to watch her, and asked if I could watch her in an emergency, promising they would pay double. I agreed. It was simple enough, and I only had one other set schedule at the time. They understood that I may not always be available for emergencies, but if I was, the double pay would be nice. My first day was pretty simple. A quick tour of the home, introducing me to Cecily, and some awkwardness when you first get to know a new child. Unlike some kids, Cecily was very outgoing, and it didn't take long for her to open up to me. She immediately wanted to show me all of her toys and play with me. She wanted to make all these plans with me, and it was really sweet. She was an only child, so I think she just really enjoyed the company and attention. And this was how the first few weeks went with me watching her. She showed me all the new things that she got or made in daycare, and we'd play for a little while. I would go into the living room and watch some TV while I did schoolwork, if I had any, and then I would make dinner, we would eat, and she would either sit in the living room with me, sometimes we'd watch a movie, or she would go play in her bedroom. Her parents said that she had what they called a settle down time, which was right after dinner. She could play or do what she wanted, as long as it was calm and quiet. It was their way of getting her ready for bed, I believe. One evening, I was in the living room and Cecily had gone to her room to play some more. Her room was the first one off the living room, so with her door open, you could hear her talking. So when she first started having a conversation, I assumed she was just playing with her dolls or stuffed animals. Really, no big deal. But usually when kids play pretend like that, you hear both sides of the conversation. In this case, I was only hearing one side. I would hear her say things like, "Purple, what's yours?" "Oh, mine too." "Did you also like cats?" "I used to, but I can't anymore." It was like there was legitimately one side of a conversation missing. I knew that she didn't have a phone because they didn't have a landline, and she didn't have her own cell phone either. So the next guess was an imaginary friend. I had encountered quite a few kids like that too, so no big deal. Later that night, I was helping her get ready for bed, and she mentioned how she had a nightlight because both she and her friend were afraid of the dark. I asked her what friend, just making conversation, and she said the one that stays the night with me. Okay, so she did have an imaginary friend. I got her into bed, and the rest of the night went by with no incident. It was probably a week or two later when the freakiest part happened. Once again, I was getting her to bed, and when I turned around to pick up one of her toys on the floor, she started laughing. I put the toy away, and when I turned back to her, I asked her in a playful tone, "What's so funny, Cecily?" "My friend, she keeps making me laugh." I asked her what her friend was saying to make her laugh. "No, she's moving her neck and making funny faces," she said, giggling. "Her neck? What's funny about someone moving their neck? Or rather, how can someone move their neck in a funny manner?" So I asked her, "What do you mean her neck? How is she moving her neck?" Cecily giggled again. "She has a giraffe neck. It's all wiggly and her tongue is blue, and mine looks that after eating candy." A giraffe neck? What does that even mean? I just told her that that does sound funny and tucked her in. I shut the door, leaving it cracked open some, and went back to the living room. Usually the imaginary friends are described like the child themselves. I had never heard a child describe them like something as wild as that before. While I sat in the living room, the thought of the giraffe neck friend was circling my head. So I went to text my friend about it. She was actually one of my former teachers and was around 12 years older than me. She reminded me that some kids are more sensitive to things that we cannot see, and maybe this wasn't an imaginary friend. Maybe it was a ghost. I hadn't even thought of that at first because I was skeptical. I feel like ghosts or spirits probably exist. Something about energy not being destroyed, maybe. But I had never had any true experiences myself. Not to mention, I feel like all of those ghost hunter shows on TV are staged, and really ruin the true experiences, if they do exist. But Cecily's description of the friend just seemed too unique and specific. That same week, when I watched her, she gave me a picture that she drew. She told me it was a picture of the three of us, myself, Cecily, and her friend. She said that she wanted to show me just how silly she looked. But what I saw made me feel like I was in some kind of scary movie. There were two normal-looking people, one by a bed and one standing by the door. And then there was a third person standing to my right. But that person was terrifying. They had a long neck that was drooping over. Think like a droopy stem on a dying flower. Their eyes appeared closed, and their mouth was frowning with their tongue sticking out. The mouth and the tongue were blue. To be blunt, it looked like someone who was suffocating or dead. That's when the neck thing started to make sense to me. This person looked like they had been hung. I tried to ask Cecily more about them, if she knew their name, or if she knew anything else, but she didn't. She said that she called her Flower because her dress looked like a flower, but then everything else she told me was the normal things you'd hear a kid tell you about their friend. Her favorite color, favorite animal, what she liked to do, and so forth. Cecily was not afraid or concerned about Flower at all. She just said that she looked funny, but that she was a good friend. I didn't know what her parents believed, and I was not about to bring it up if they didn't, and make myself look crazy. As long as she wasn't having problems, I figured I should just let it go. And that's what I did. I continued to watch Cecily for months after this. She rarely brought up Flower unless I mentioned her, which was rare. But knowing that she potentially had a ghost friend was pretty freaky to me. Cecily's mom's shift changed, so I was no longer needed after some time, and we never had any troubles throughout my time with them. But now, all this time after, Cecily and her dead friend live rent-free in my head. Hopefully she was at least a good influence, and hopefully Cecily was able to bring her some peace. About 8 years ago, my now husband and I had finally bought our first house together. I was 33, him 35, and I was excited to finally have a place to call our own. We had always rented prior. One of the things I was most excited about was having a decent yard that I could decorate myself. I had recently lost my grandmother, and she always loved gardening. She ended up in a nursing home towards the end of her life, and one of the last things she mentioned was how much she missed her garden. So, now with my own yard, I wanted to make a garden dedicated to her. She loved lilacs and peonies, so I was going to plant lilacs along the house. They smelled wonderful anyways. And then I thought I would plant some peonies in a raised box towards the back. I also planned on planting some butterfly bushes and wild flowers to help the bees and butterfly population. But it seemed like some people had other ideas. The first few months of us moving in involved more of getting to know the neighbors and getting unpacked. We moved in late autumn, and gardening was not on my mind at that point. I wanted to have my home set up first. So, we got to know the neighbors as you normally do, with them being nosy of the new people. That's not me being mean either. Most of our neighbors are actually really nice, and even reliable. They would see us outside and holler to us, and then come over and introduce themselves. One of the people that did this was our neighbor to the right, Dan. Dan was a bit older, I think in his 60s, but he seemed to be a very by-the-book guy. One thing that I should explain, our neighborhood was not part of an HOA, or homeowners association. I cannot stand the thought of that and how controlling it is, so it was something we looked into when we chose our home. However, Dan seemed to want it to be part of an HOA. With his introduction, he gave almost like a rundown of how the neighborhood functioned. Trash pickup is every Friday. Recycling every other Friday. We don't put our bins out until Friday morning. Otherwise, it just looks trashy to have them sitting there all night. We have a quarterly city council meeting that's open to anyone that wants to attend. I'm the lead speaker, so if you have any concerns or questions, you can just tell me. I'm the one that runs it all anyways. I could instantly tell the type of guy that Dan was. He tried to run that neighborhood. Absolutely. But while I thought he could definitely be a pain, he couldn't enforce anything. So I just braced myself to potentially have one of those types of difficult neighbors. Ultimately, I was not going to let him get in the way of having my dream home. As spring arrived, I began working on my yard and plotting out the gardens. As I was marking the stakes, Dan popped his head over the little fence and asked what I was up to. I started explaining my ideas, and mid-sentence he interrupted me. Lilacs get too tall. And the wildflowers, those are an eyesore. You'll be digging it all up when it's blooming when you start getting all those bees, he said, laughing. I've dealt with my fair share of judgmental folks, so I smiled politely and said that that was the point. I wanted to attract the bees because they are important, and the lilacs are important to my grandmother. He laughed again and made some remark about me being some kind of hippie. We both laughed, but not for the same reason, and I continued working on my yard. Dan watched for a while and then left. Then, the problems started occurring. A few days later, I went out to start plotting my seeds, and I noticed my stakes had all been disturbed. They looked to be walked over, pulled out, and trampled. I was confused, but more so disappointed by it. There were no clear prints from shoes, or a foot, so I assumed that something may have just gotten into our yard. The front yard was open, but there was an arched gate to get to the back, which was surrounded by a very old privacy fence. It was falling apart in one of the back corners, and we were planning on fixing it that year, or the next, depending on our budget. With how it sat, I thought that something could have crawled under the fence. I just got over it. Thankfully, I hadn't planted anything yet. I was just outlining where everything was going to go, so I just had to quickly redo it. Then, it happened again. This time, I had already put in my bulbs and planted my lilac bushes. When I went out there to look at it, there were holes in the ground. And before anyone asks, these weren't from moles. I had experienced those in my last home and was familiar with what they looked like. These holes looked like they were done haphazardly with a hand shovel. Some of my bulbs looked damaged, like they'd been hit. And some were even just sitting on top of the soil. I just remember standing there, trying to balance a lilac bush while fixing the soil around it, when I heard Dan behind me, slurping his coffee. He asked me what had happened, and I told him that I had no clue. I was upset, so I explained how I had planted everything and that something was digging it up. He immediately had an idea as to what was happening. According to him, a long time ago, the owner of my home went insane and started killing things from humans to animals and burying them in the yard. He claimed that that brought bad omens to the house, and said that the previous owner moved out because of issues with the house being haunted. He then said that that probably affects the yard too, since I may be disturbing remains. The problem with this theory was that it was total BS. My dad actually knew the previous owners. They were an older couple that moved to be closer to their grandkids. That was it. Not to mention stuff like that has to be on the details of the house. Then there's also the fact that I do not believe in ghosts. I'm not a fan of paranormal stories in the slightest, because they never really bode true to me. So when he finished his explanation, I laughed. I made a joke about it, and Dan seemed annoyed. Maybe he was offended or something else, I wasn't sure, but he just eventually walked off and I went back to fixing my garden. A few days later, I was leaving for work, and as I stepped outside, I could smell something really bad. It was almost sulfuric smelling, and I just remember it making me gag. I just assumed, since it was trash day, maybe someone threw away something that was pretty rank, and that it would be gone by the time I got home. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The stench was still there when I got home, and it was so bad that I couldn't even open my windows. I didn't work on the yard at all that week, until the following weekend because of other things taking up my time. But when I finally got back to it that weekend, I had a surprise waiting for me. Everything had been planted at this point. I just needed to clean up a few things and put it in my small fence to mark it off, to make sure that we didn't hit anything with the mower. But, once again, my seeds looked disturbed. The dirt was scattered with a small hole on one side, and a larger mound on the other. I sat on the ground, ready to just even it all out and give up on the idea of having a neat row of flowers. At that point, they were just going to be scattered, but it would be alright. But as I moved the dirt, with my bare hands, mind you, I touched something solid in the dirt. Not thinking much of it, I grabbed it and pulled it out some, and then realized it was a rabbit. Knowing that there was a dead rabbit in my garden and that I just touched it, I screamed. My husband was in the shed, so he ran over to me as I wildly explained what I just found. As we stood there observing the rabbit and wondering how it got there, who would pop their ugly head up but Dan? He was just watching when I finally saw him in the corner of my vision. He was looking around and asked what was wrong when my husband told him what I found. The whole time, he didn't have a single look of concern or shock. This man that thought the neighborhood revolved around him wasn't disturbed that something or someone had partially buried a rabbit in my yard. With my suspicion growing, I asked him if he knew anything about it, and his response was, "Well, I told your wife about the yard being haunted. The previous owner didn't like big gardens because he would bury people in it." I was livid. I knew everything that had been happening had to have been him. He didn't like my plans from the beginning. He tried everything he could other than flat out telling me not to do it, probably because he had no leg to stand on. He had to have been the one to put the rabbit there too, trying to scare me. So I did what any sane person would have done. I walked over and grabbed the rabbit, again with my bare hands, walked it to the fence, and I chucked it right at Dan. That's when he looked shocked. He finally had emotion on his face. I yelled at him about being a controlling creep. I told him that if he trespassed again, I would call the cops, and I went back inside. A few days later, I put up a no trespassing sign and ordered a camera to watch the gate. I wasn't worried about the yard itself, because he was older and larger and kind of wobbled at times, so there was no way he was going to be jumping the fence. He most likely was just opening the gate and walking right in. Surprisingly, I didn't have any issues with my yard, and my garden wasn't touched after that. Dan never talked to me again. He wouldn't even look at me. Sometimes he would say hi or something to my husband, but never to me. I'm sure it went around the neighborhood that I was crazy too. I know what I did was far from the most rational response, but at the time, I was too upset. I was trying to make a simple memorial garden for my late grandmother, and all he wanted to do was stop me. And for no real reason but to be a controlling dick. However, it did seem to solve the problem of our neighbor's unhealthy obsession with controlling our yard. Our home was built on a cornfield, along with several blocks of homes just before a circling horse fence, with several horses inside at the end of our neighborhood in 1958. No other home had stood here before. My parents purchased it new, and I live in it to this day, and I'm one of my parents' 2 daughters. When I was only 4, my mother and sister and I had been cleaning an area where we kept our toys and random things. We straightened, organized, made up a bag for Goodwill, and threw out items, vacuumed the bare concrete floor, and then mopped it and came back upstairs. I hated steps at that age, and there were a set of 10 steep steps, and I didn't want to be rushed. So my mother led the way upstairs, followed by my older sister, who was 9.5. We trudged up, feeling that we had accomplished something. Suddenly, I felt someone push my foot from behind. It nearly made me trip. These steps had no backboard. I was never a crier, and it scared me, and also made me mad. My mother demanded what was wrong as she was almost to the top. I said, not even understanding, that my sister had pushed me. She said that she couldn't have because she was ahead of me. I didn't know how, I said, but I knew my mother would never do it. I didn't even know about ghosts, so it never could enter my mind. I cried, being scared and feeling misunderstood and confused. Fast forward, and I was 45. I was downstairs and walked up the steps in our ranch-style home. Suddenly, I felt what seemed to be a person push my foot, as if to trip me. I froze, and my memory from being a kid flashed back into my mind. Other things have happened. To condense events, I've heard something like steel screws in a tray being looked through, or maybe rattling metal chains. Saw one male outline, as if all made of shadow, heard a loud smash and thought as I'd heard glass, it must have been a burglar. But we had sturdy glass block windows. Looking everywhere, all doors and windows upstairs were intact. But we feared going downstairs and had the door to our basement open, so I looked down the steps, seeing nothing. Then, really loudly and suddenly, slammed that wood basement door and threw on the brass slide bar lock. When it slammed, my sister and I heard what sounded like a man screaming out, startled. Like, ugh! Then, I was sure it was a burglar. We had old security doors that are deadbolts made of steel and tempered glass that, once deadbolted, barred exiting without a key. We locked back in front so no one could escape. We both recently got our concealed carry license, and my sister and I, in long night shirts and bed socks, and guns raised and fresh out of our baths, left the house with our long hair, wet, and streaming down our backs. It was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. We live in Kentucky. We had no pets then. We stealthily walked all around every wall of our house, a red brick ranch. We had a flashlight, and it was strong. Each window was highlighted and noted not to be broken, and then each basement window on two sides, which are tough glass blocks. It was clear that no window, door, or basement block was breached, nor anything we could see of our rooftop. We knew that we had heard glass breaking. It wasn't until the next day that we even ventured down there, and there was no sign of anything having fallen, broken glass, etc. It was weird. As well, all my life, I'd heard my father working on projects in our basement, and often he would play music, or the radio as he worked. This went on for many years. If it was too loud and I was studying, I would ask him to please turn it down. He would. But one night he said that he didn't have any music on, and I was trying hard to study, and it was loud. It made me mad, and I said something in frustration to him, and he replied that he really had nothing on. Suddenly I believed him. Well, fast forward to when he was in his late 80s, he had a caregiver in our home, as I was at my full-time job. One part of the week was one lady, and the middle to Friday was a second caregiver, and then Saturday and Sunday the two alternated. Each of them separately left me notes, asking where a radio was in our basement, because it was way too loud downstairs. I told them that there is no longer any radio down there, nor anything similar. They all insisted that there was. Finally, one day a friend of mine from work agreed to cover one weekend, and also experienced this, and I went over the whole basement finding no radio, and said that it sounded like a very old radio show, where an announcer says the name of a whiny clarinet song. I'd heard it for years myself coming up the furnace register, but for years just assumed it was something my dad was playing. But now he was confined to bed, and no music could play as there was no radio, TV, or tape recorder there. So my friend wrote a blessing prayer on a dry erase board there, and I went down there and said to whatever that weird pressurized feeling was in our basement, who I was, and that we owned the house fair and square, and that it had been blessed upon moving in. I said it all right and out loud. I said as owner that they were to leave and never return, and that I was blessing the grounds, building, airspace, attic, basement, and living floors in Jesus' name, and shook holy water all over the home, especially in that weird feeling area of the basement. It seemed to work. I also posted a crucifix right near my friend's written blessing. No one but me goes down there except the furnace maintenance man twice yearly. So it was weird when the other day, the entire dry erase board that was made up many years with my friend's basement prayer was completely gone. Just vanished. But how? I worked for a lawn and landscaping company for several years. I made some mistakes as a young adult, causing me to get my GED late, so finding a good paying job in my 20s was difficult. But this company took me in, and I really felt like they gave me a second chance. And I will always be grateful for them. However, we still worked with the public, so we definitely got a fair share of weird and memorable customers. This is a story about one of them named Larry. Larry was a longtime customer that we remembered because of one of his weird requests. He claimed to be satisfied with our services, except he wanted us to use his weed whacker only. He claimed that the wiring he used was less damaging to his grass. I don't think our boss believed it, but it was cheaper than the stuff that we used, so he actually bought some that he installed on a few machines to specifically use at his place. Once he showed him, he seemed satisfied, and we started using our own equipment. We had a policy that we couldn't use a customer's equipment for safety reasons, so at least the owner was willing to work with the customer. Other than that specific demand, Larry was an alright guy. He was friendly enough to all of us, but also stayed out of our way. And his wife was old-fashioned and tried to offer us drinks all the time. Very kind people. They would occasionally have yard games or kids' toys in the yard. Typically, they picked those up before we got there, but if we did find some, Larry just asked us to toss them in a small shed in the back. No big deal. I had 2 very young kids of my own at the time, and I knew that you could only ask them to do something so many times before you had to just do it yourself, or possibly forget it. On this day, we started working on the yard, when I spotted a few toys in the back. I picked them up and, per the norm, I started walking them over to the shed. As I stood in front of the shed before I opened it, I noticed that it now had a padlock on it. However, it was only on the one handle and obviously unlocked. I noticed it because Larry never had a lock on the door before. I just assumed that maybe he had issues with trespassers, or was worried about the kids getting in there by themselves. It was one of those moments that I noticed, didn't think much of it because it wasn't any of my business anyways, and proceeded to open the door. But once I entered the shed, I was provided with a different sight. It was definitely a makeshift lab, but not for drugs, but explosives. I saw wiring, weird pipe pieces, metal scraps, and several packages of powder and bottles of liquids. What the hell was I looking at? Not to mention, I had already had a run-in with the law, and I knew that I wanted no part of any of this, so I calmed myself, tossed the toy in the shed, and walked out, just humming a song. I walked in humming and was trying to stay calm. That all nearly crumbled when I saw Larry standing right outside the shed. He looked pissed. I wasn't expecting him to be standing there, so it made me jump. I tried to laugh it off, but he asked me what I was doing in there. I just calmly pointed out the items in the yard that I was putting away. He tried to argue with me that it was locked, but I pointed out the lock on the handle and explained that it was already unlocked and open. I also tried to point out that this is what we had always done, literally per his instructions. His demeanor changed. It reminded me of the calm but obviously upset voice a parent would use on their child when they wanted them to admit something they did. I'm familiar with it because of my own parents and how I use it on my own kids. He asked me what all I saw in the shed. We both knew the answer to this. He knew what I saw, and I took this as him trying to intimidate or threaten me. I tried to think fast to get myself out of the situation and back to my job, so I could never think about it again. So, I tried to play dumb. I acted kind of excited about it. What, with the chemicals? Yeah, it looks like you're making your own fertilizer, right? I figured you would. Your lawn is a lot greener than the rest of the block. I then tried to BS something about using a certain enzyme to help with growth, with the purpose of boring him, I hoped. I was really trying to look naive, and to my surprise, it seemed to work. His shoulders dropped, and his eyes softened. He no longer looked on the defensive, so I thought I was successful. He told me that that was correct, and thanked me for my advice, apologized about the toys, and then dismissed me to get back to work. I started walking away and finished my work, but the rest of the time there, I felt his eyes on me. I avoided talking to anyone that I worked with unless it was loud enough for him to hear, so he knew that I wasn't talking about him. I continued working, or would make jokes, hoping to keep him off of my back too. But he still watched me, making me feel incredibly uncomfortable. As we left, Larry was back to being his normal friendly self, and when we were all back at the shop, or home, I was still thinking about what I saw. I knew there had to be something bad going on in that shed. I contemplated on what I could do, if anything, for a few days. I also tried to be reasonable. Maybe all the chemicals were there for a completely harmless reason, but I really couldn't think of any. I knew what some of the things were that I saw. I won't name them here for obvious reasons, but from what I knew of them, there was not a good reason to have them. It didn't make sense. And knowing he had at least one child and a wife, I knew I needed to tell someone. This was long enough ago that I drove to a gas station, used a payphone on the side of the building, and left an anonymous tip. I told them that I was a neighbor, but I didn't want to give my name, and I explained what I saw in his shed. I told them how they seemed very suspicious and secretive about the shed, and that I was worried about the chemicals that he stored in there. I think it may have helped that we were in a drought, so the risk of a fire was pretty high. I felt awful afterwards. I worried that maybe I was just overreacting. I worried that they would find out it was me, and then I would be punished. By authorities, by Larry, by my work. My work and my little family was all I had at the time, so I couldn't afford to lose my job. But I also couldn't just keep my head down, especially if I would eventually have to go back there. Luckily, I didn't have to do that. It was about 2 weeks later that it was finally on the news, not to mention talked about at my work. Police went to Larry's home and said that they were given a tip that they were required to follow up on. The thing is, at first, it was just a request. They could have been told to come back with a warrant, but part of the reason that it escalated and was in the news was because Larry immediately went on the defensive. He apparently refused to even let them in the house, ended up locking himself inside the shed, and threatened to end his own life. When they finally got to him, they found all the same things that I saw and confirmed my suspicions. Something had happened with Larry's job. It wasn't specified, but he was angry about it. He planned on blowing the office up and going out with it. Thankfully, none of that occurred. The news said that he was apprehended beforehand and was being tried for a bunch of things. I don't remember the exact outcome, but I do know that they were trying to go with an insanity defense. I was honestly shocked to find out what happened as I followed the story. Larry was such a nice guy in the beginning. He knew how things worked. He talked to all of us like we were friends. And then, something happened to him, and I witnessed the beginnings of it. Then it all spiraled downward for him. Part of me still feels bad for calling it in, but at the same time, I have to remember that I could have saved so many lives. And that's what I stick with. And that's what I choose to hold on to. And I instill in my kids, now in their teen years, that if you see something, say something. Tell someone you trust, because you don't want to live with the regrets of not doing anything after it's too late. Hi. I hope that this is relevant to this sub. I just found you all, and I relate to a lot of these stories, so I wanted to share my own. If soulmates are real, I wholeheartedly believe that my dog, Jake, is one of my soulmates. From the moment that I met him, something told me that we have been together in many past lives, and we should be together in this one. Jake was one of 12 puppies that my aunt's dog Maya gave birth to. They live out in the country, so their dogs kind of just wander, and one day Maya showed up pregnant. I was having a sleepover with my cousins, and I got to meet all of the puppies. They were so tiny that they literally fit in the palm of your hand. I remember immediately really liking Jake, because he was one of the only male puppies to be brown. Other than that, all the brown ones were girls, and all the black ones were boys. My aunt was trying to find homes for these puppies, but I already knew that my parents didn't want to have more than one dog. We had a German Shepherd at the time, so I didn't even ask. A few months passed, and I eventually had another sleepover with my cousins. At this point, the puppies had grown up. I believe they were about 7 weeks old, so still little, but definitely puppies. There were only about 5 puppies left, so I was really excited to see that Jake was still there, but, again, I knew my mom and dad didn't want another dog, so I had no intention of taking him home that day. Jake, however, had other plans. The whole 2 days that I spent with my cousins, Jake followed me everywhere. He even jumped into the pool after I did, and I knew that I had to at least ask. When I looked into Jake's eyes, I feel like he was telling me that I was meant to be his human. Well, my mom pulls up to pick me up, and I'm standing in the driveway holding a puppy next to all of my cousins, with a huge grin on my face. She could immediately tell that I was about to ask her something. As soon as I started explaining, all of my cousins joined in and said that I needed to take Jake with me. My mom was reluctant, but she said that she would give me a 2-week trial to prove that I would take care of this dog all by myself. I believe I was 11 years old at this point. If 2 weeks go by and I don't prove that I'm responsible enough, then we would bring the dog right back. I spent the rest of my summer sleeping on the couch in the living room next to Jake in his crate, so that I could wake up whenever he started whining to go to the bathroom outside. During the day, I spent all my time training him and taking care of him. Needless to say, I passed the 2-week trial, and for 14 years, I spent almost every waking moment with Jake attached at my hip. When I would leave the house for sleepovers or Girl Scout camp, he would spend most of his time sitting by the door waiting for me to get back. In 2017, I moved out of my parents' house, and unfortunately I could not take Jake with me. We didn't have room for him, and he also had a younger dog sibling at this point who adored him, so I didn't want to separate them. However, I only moved 30 minutes away, so I often would have playdates with Jake or take him to the dog salon for a spa day. My biggest fear, though, was him passing away while I was not near him. One day, in October of 2021, I'm having another playdate with Jake. But in my mind, I knew something was different. Jake was pretty old at this point, had had 2 ACL surgeries, and was relatively slow-moving, so our playdates were usually just us chilling on the couch together while I scrolled on my phone or something. But the whole time, my brain is just telling me over and over again that I needed to give Jake every ounce of my attention. I put my phone down and just laid next to him and pet him. He didn't seem any different than how he usually was. He was just happy and chill. I spent the whole day with him. His younger dog sibling was even at doggy daycare, so it was literally just me and Jake at my parents' house. I also took tons of photos of him and with him that day. Night came, and my parents came home from work. I saw Jake stumbling into the living room where his dog bed is, and immediately noticed that something was off. I was supposed to head home, but everything in me was telling me to stay. About 30 minutes later, it really became apparent that Jake was in his final moments of his life. His head was in my lap, and my mom, dad, younger brother, and my partner were all there with him. His little sister was also right there, coming over to sniff Jake every now and then. I just kept petting him until he took his final breath in my arms. I don't know what it is that made me aware of this day being Jake's final day on Earth, but I'm really glad that I tuned into whatever it was. Maybe it was even Jake who decided when he would leave this life, and he waited until I was with him. Who knows? Jake was my best friend in this life, and I know that I will see him in the next. For years, I liked to visit my maternal grandmother on weekends. My 2 male cousins and I, a girl, liked to ice skate Friday nights in October when the season began for the indoor rink. We would then go to my grandmother's and make an old Chef Boyardee boxed pizza together as we watched crazy Friday night broadcast TV. When we'd eaten and gotten tired, I shared a room with the 2 twin beds with my grandma, and one boy lay on the living room couch, and one had a bed in the back room. So that was the normal drill weekly. Well, this week they weren't coming. And that was okay. Grandma and I would talk a lot, and then finally she would snore a little snore, and was soon up going to the bathroom 100 times. All the while, a Black Forest cuckoo clock her son had given her from his travels in the military went off again. It was horrible. It went off hourly, plus the swinging of the pendulum that ticked off the seconds. She would awaken often. I too was, and am, a night person, so we would talk some more, and I told her that it was the clock as to why she couldn't sleep. But she didn't want to turn it off, as my dad had repaired it, and she refused to risk messing it up again. Soon, she awakened again, and, well, I had never slept. She had a little. She went nearby to the bathroom, and being the house was on a busy corner near a main street, you would hear cars or see their lights through the drawn shades or around them. Teens would sometimes stop at that corner and drink, and then throw the bottles and cans in her side yard by that bedroom. So, when I saw the car lights stopped, I watched warily. We'd have to pick up the bottles tomorrow morning, I mused. And then it remained. A single light in a circular shape was in the corner. It seemed to grow in width more and more. And then, suddenly, a face with a moving mouth that looked horrible was in it. I could still hear Grandma washing her hands, and she was returning from that bathroom. I was petrified and wanted to tell her to stay back. It was grotesque and so scary as his ugly face moved. I oddly thought that it was so strange that I could even see it without my glasses, as I was very nearsighted. I prayed and forced my eyes closed, and told myself after that prayer I would open them again, and did this, now seeing the outline of Grandma returning to the bed. I said, "Grandma, look, it's 2:30 a.m. now by the Sony flip flag numerals." I said, "I just want to tell you something weird tomorrow. Not now. I want you to verify that I'm perfectly awake and not dreaming. I haven't slept at all with that clock, and I'll tell you tomorrow." The next day, she verified that I had been fully awake. At the time, there were no fancy video projectors that could have made that image, and it was just all so creepy. I've always been really good with kids. I'm the oldest of 8 siblings, and now have 5 nephews and 4 nieces. It seemed to always just come naturally to me, to be a shoo-in parent when I babysat or just watched my siblings, or being the cool aunt that they all trusted. At the time of this event, I was around 26, single and living in my house by myself. Well, other than my 2 cats. My neighborhood had a lot of families in it that had 1 to 3 kids in each. They were all pretty nice, and, honestly, fairly well-behaved kids. When they would ride their bikes while I was out in my yard, they would wave and say hi. Sometimes they would be doing donations or fundraisers for their schools, and I would participate. It was, honestly, a pretty peaceful neighborhood, and I loved it. But then there was a family that moved in that kind of disrupted that peaceful life for me. I had found out that it was a mom and a dad and their son that all called Tommy. They had all moved into the dad's parents' house, apparently his childhood home. I don't know if it was to help to take care of his mom, or if maybe something happened to them and they lost their house. I didn't talk much to the parents. They also lived a few houses down, so I didn't really have an opportunity to do so. But Tommy, I definitely had multiple run-ins with him, and I wish that I hadn't. Tommy was probably around 11 or 12, I believe. He started out as just another normal kid on the block. I saw him playing with some of the other kids, riding bikes and such, so I paid no extra attention to it. But then there was one day that I was out front, mowing my little yard. I started getting that feeling that I was being watched. I stopped the mower and looked around and just saw Tommy standing at the edge of my driveway. He was just staring at me, watching intently. I smiled and waved at him, but he didn't wave back. It was weird, and I tried to shrug it off and continue mowing, but I could sense that he was still watching me. From that day on, I started to sense that there was something about him that just did not sit right with me. A few days after the mowing event, I was sitting on my porch swing, reading and enjoying my coffee. It was one of my favorite things to do when I had nothing to do. My front yard wasn't fenced in, so it was normal for people or kids to walk over, or sometimes even pets that got out, or strays. I pretty much welcomed all of it. It was a safe neighborhood. Who wouldn't want to pet a new cat or dog? The swing was on the left side of my porch, and my driveway was on the right, so I didn't see someone walking up at first until I heard a kid shout, "What are you reading?" I looked up, startled, and saw Tommy standing near my porch steps, holding a small knife, with his head tilted and eyes locked on me. I told him the name of the book, and he asked what it was about, so I explained it briefly. Yes, I'm a sucker for romance books and spooky YouTube stories. So I was joking around, and I said something like, "It's a romance about 2 people falling in love," thinking he would be like, gross or something. I kind of got that response, but a lot more intense. That sounds boring. You should read a book about a serial killer. I do like thriller books too, but why be so specific? About a serial killer? I asked him why, and he just said they're cool and more interesting. Wanting to change the subject, I asked him why he had a pocket knife on him. He shrugged and then held up the knife like he was studying it. I don't know, in case I need to stab something. I know I had to have a concerned look on my face. My brother and I found a knife in the dirt one day when we were younger, and after looking it over and me almost cutting my finger trying to close it, I brought it to my mom. I was always scared of me or my siblings getting hurt, so I tried my best to prevent it where I could. So when he just nonchalantly said, in case he needed to stab something, it kind of bothered me. I tried asking what he would need to stab and where he got it from, but he said he didn't know and that he just found it. Maybe he could sense that I was ready to take it from him or something, because he quickly turned back around and walked off without saying anything else. I knew it was dangerous for him to have that knife, but I felt like I had no place to tell his parents it wasn't okay, so I never did. I wasn't a friend, family, or even a teacher, so I just kept it to myself. From then on, I seemed to see Tommy everywhere. Yeah, it was normal to see kids in the neighborhood, but it was more than that. I would leave and see Tommy standing at the edge of my driveway. I would be coming home and he would be sitting on the rock hill across the street, like he was waiting for me to get home. I would even go out for a jog and I would see him, standing nearby, just watching. He was a small child, so why did it feel like I was prey being stalked? There were a few more major incidents with Tommy that really freaked me out. The next one happened one Sunday evening. Our trash collectors came every Monday morning, so I had to take my bins out. Later that night, I forgot to empty my recycling bin and groaned that I had to walk to the end of the driveway with it. But I bucked up and took it out. As I started walking it out, I noticed my trash bin was knocked over, and I heard some soft shuffling. I had never had issues with my bins before, but I knew that we had a few raccoons in the area, so I was nervous at first to get any closer. But then I saw Tommy pop up from it. His eyes were wide, like he'd been startled too, but everything else about him seemed calm. I asked him a little more sternly, because why wouldn't I be angry or curious? "Tommy, what are you doing?" He again shrugged and said, "I like your stuff. It's cool." He then held up an empty soda can and said, "Can I keep this?" I was so creeped out and confused that I just nodded. He smiled and shoved the can in his pocket and walked away. I went back in my house thinking, what the hell was that? What did he mean I had cool stuff? Why was he going through my trash? Why was he out so late, and how many times had he done this before? He didn't make a mess, at least, but still, going through someone else's trash was weird and potentially dangerous. He didn't know what I had in there. Still, not comfortable with telling his parents, I decided to make a post on the Nextdoor app. I just mentioned something about how someone had been going through my trash, and that it was definitely a person. A kid, at that. But I couldn't tell who it was. Unfortunately, no one said that they were having a similar experience, but that they would keep an eye out. So, Tommy seemed to be singling me out specifically. This made it even weirder for me. What was he hoping to find in my trash? It definitely creeped me out, but he was still a kid. Maybe he was just an oddball. I grew up with some myself, and I'm sure some thought I was one too. I didn't go through other people's trash, but regardless, I thought I could just deal with it, seeing him occasionally, until he got older and grew out of it. But of course it wouldn't be that easy. One of the creepiest experiences happened one night when I was sitting at home, enjoying my night off. After having dinner, I took a shower and went straight to my room wrapped in a towel to grab my pajamas. As I started getting dressed, I heard a tapping sound on my window. I had dark purple curtains drawn so I couldn't see out, but I knew we were expecting a pretty crazy storm that night. I assumed it was the rain or maybe even hail hitting it, so I ignored it. After I was dressed, I went to put on my slippers as I was planning on lounging in the living room for a while when I heard the tapping sound again. This time it was a little louder and also too patterned for me to ignore. I went to the window and slowly pulled the curtains apart when I nearly had a heart attack. There was Tommy, his face pressed against my window, smiling and waving wildly. I screamed, "What the hell, Tommy? Go home!" I don't know if he could hear me, but I was scared and angry. Why was he trying to look into my window? Not to mention, it made sense then that he was knocking on the window, so he was probably trying to get my attention, and not just trying to peep. But why? After I said this, I closed my windows and ran to my backyard. The window was on the side of the house, but it was easier to get to from the back. I ran outside, still in my slippers. Thankfully, it wasn't raining yet, and I saw him slowly walking back to the front. He wasn't running. He didn't look scared or like he was caught either, just kind of browsing. I know that I was scared and upset, so I should have calmed down. He was still a kid after all, but I plainly asked him, "Tommy, why are you in my yard? You need to go home before I tell your parents." He just looked at me and shrugged. "I don't know, I just like watching you." I told him to go home, and I watched him walk out of my yard and up the street. I will remind you that it was dark out. It was about to storm. He didn't ride his bike, based on how he kept walking up the street, and he lived a few houses down. Why did his parents not seem to care about his whereabouts? I was frustrated, but also part of me was concerned for him. So I even walked to the end of my driveway to make sure that he got home safely. I could just barely see him enter, but I did see him walk up to the porch patio. It was kind of hard to sleep that night, wondering if he would come back. So I slept in the living room. The next day I contemplated what to do. I didn't want to call the police. He was still young, and I'm not the type to think that being arrested and traumatizing a child, nonetheless, was a solution. So I told myself it was time to tell his parents. Something needed to be done, and it should probably start at home. So I got out to my car earlier than I usually do for work, and I drove over to Tommy's house. His mom answered, and I immediately, and politely, explained what had happened. I explained the knife that he had. I mentioned him watching me and seemingly following me. I also mentioned how he was trying to look through my window. I would not have expected her response. She didn't look surprised whatsoever. She didn't look shocked or embarrassed. She didn't even apologize for his actions. I know that I wasn't a parent, but I think if a stranger or neighbor approached me and told me the same thing about my kid, I would be concerned about his actions. Instead, she shrugged and said, "Yeah, well, you know, boys will be boys. He's at that age where he's really curious about girls." Then, she had the audacity to ask me if I was undressing with the windows open. It was my own house. Why do I need to watch what I'm doing in my own home? I didn't want to start a fight with this woman, so I just said that he needed to stay out of my yard, or else I would have to call the police. She literally rolled her eyes at me and said that she would talk to him about it, and then practically shut the door in my face. I left their house feeling like nothing was accomplished. I didn't know what else to do. I just hoped that even if she didn't take what I said seriously, that she would at least tell him to stay out of my yard. and it seems like that was the only thing that happened. I still saw him watching me when I went out for a jog. I saw him across the street. He was everywhere, but he did stay out of my yard. It was still unnerving. Why was this kid watching me? Why was I the target? I wish I could say there was a better ending to this story, but there wasn't. I just lived with this. I didn't know if he was finally talked to or if he grew bored, but he did slowly stop. Or at least was less noticeable. I still live in the same house, and his family moved out about a year ago. I don't know what happened or why, but I'm honestly thankful they moved. I hope that if this was a phase, that Tommy did just grow out of it, and that his parents were more involved and talked to him about how that was unacceptable. Otherwise, the neighborhood is still great, and I think I'll stick around. I will let you know if I get any more weird neighbors, though. Quick disclaimer. I was not under any influence during this event, and am of sound state of mind. During my time at college, I picked up a few good and a few bad habits. One of the bad habits was cigarette smoking. My mom had recently been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. She was strong and fought through her treatment, and survived the ordeal. After which, my smoking habit made me more and more unhappy, given the reality of cancer and the devastation it had caused my family, if only temporary given my mom's treatment success. During this time, I became very self-loathing regarding my cigarette use. The day of the event, I had steeped myself into a deep meditative state. The intention of the meditation was to find inspiration to stop smoking. As someone with much experience meditating, I am often able to reach deep states of meditation. Point being, this was not an abnormal meditative session for me. When meditating, after reaching this deep state, I felt a human hand on my right shoulder. The hand did not fully rest on my shoulder, but rather only the hand's fingers, and presumably fingernail tips were on my shoulder. The hand slowly moved across my back from right shoulder to left shoulder. I clearly recall being able to identify the 5 fingers lightly running over my back, just as you would if you relax your hand and run it over yourself. Once the hand had reached my left shoulder, while the hand was still in contact with me, I heard a faint feminine voice, just slightly louder than a whisper. "You're a good person." Please understand that this event occurred over 1 to 2 seconds, so it was very quick despite my lofty explanation. I immediately broke my meditation and anxiously scanned the room that I was in for the individual who just touched and spoke to me. There was no one. At the time, I was a devout atheist, and I lived in a 100-year-old house, converted to a 3-floor apartment building. My atheist mind could not comprehend the experience, leaving the only rational explanation that I had either imagined it, or that there were intelligences beyond the physical realm that we live. The experience was so vivid, and I so lucid, that I was unable to accept the former, and was left with the latter. This experience profoundly changed my perception of reality. That day, I believe that I was touched from the beyond. Hi friends. I tried to post this in the Glitch in the Matrix subreddit, but it got flagged by the mods, so I'm going to try here. It was probably 2018 or so. I'm in my mid-20s. I was living in a house with roommates at the time, and everything was normal. The house didn't even have creepy vibes or anything. There was no party happening, no drugs or alcohol, just normal. Beside my bed is a little table where I charge my phone and have my lamp. Important details. Anyway, it was creeping up toward midnight, so I decided to turn in for the night. I get in bed, plug my phone in, turn off my lamp, and close my eyes, just like I always do. The next thing I know, my lamp is on, I'm sitting up in bed, my phone is plugged in, and I'm pressing the side button to turn it off. I place it on my bedside table, and then my consciousness returns to me. I'm like, wait, didn't I just do this and get in bed? What the hell? I glance at my phone that I just put down, and it's 12:15 a.m., approximately 15 to 20 minutes after I knew that I went to sleep the first time. My mind starts racing, and I feel anxiety bubble up. And then I look at my phone, and no lie, it starts ringing. No caller ID. 12:15 a.m. on some random night. Like, this does not happen to me. I'm in too much shock to answer and am low-key freaking out. I watch it ring and eventually stop. No voicemail. A no-caller ID phone call in the middle of the night after I just lost 15 to 20 minutes? No joke. I deadass go to the bathroom to look at myself in the mirror to check for any marks, or bruises, or scratches that weren't there before. But everything is normal. I go back to my room to everything still being normal. Eventually my nerves settle, and I fall asleep. And that's where my story has a decidedly unsatisfying end. Nothing happened the next day. There were no lasting ramifications or weird changes after that. Nada. But, man, if I could go back and choose to answer that call, I wonder what would have happened. Who would have been on the other end? And did they have answers to what had just happened to me? It feels too coincidental to not be related. Does anyone know of this sort of thing? Has anything similar happened to you? I'm honestly trying to get some insight here. Thanks. So, at around 12 a.m. after I had gotten off work, my boyfriend at the time and I were watching TV and had just finished smoking some funky devil lettuce when there's a knock at the door. We both look at each other in confusion when a second round of knocks goes off. He gets up off the couch, looks out the peephole, and recognizes that it's a woman that had talked his head off when he was checking these apartments out before moving in. She, as he describes, is probably in her 50s and very annoying. He sees her every morning when he goes to work, and she always waits for him to leave first before driving off. He reluctantly opens the door as I take the paraphernalia out of sight. I can hear her voice, but she's speaking incoherently until he deciphers heat and not working. To which he says, "Your heat's not working?" She says yes, and asks him to look at it when our cat walks out the door, so he closed it to pick her up. The lady begins walking up the stairs, so he brings the cat back in and follows. He sees the woman standing there as he reaches the tops of the steps, and from her doorways she says, "Never mind, it's working," but then notes that all the lights in her apartment were off. It was pitch black. She then says, "You could still come in and take a look at it if you want." He, finally gaining some wits, declined, and decides not to wait around for anything else weird to happen. So he turns around and descends down the steps, returning to our apartment, where he sat in silence for 5 minutes, trying to piece together what just happened, before regaling me with the story I just told you. After a bit, he heads to bed as he has to work early in the morning. After about 30 minutes or so, it's now 1:30 to 2 a.m., my boyfriend is dead asleep, as he's notorious for knocking out instantly, when I hear steps coming down the stairs, and then, you guessed it, knocking. But faint, this time. I know it's not on my door, so I look out the eye hole, and there she is again, knocking on my neighbor's door, yelling more incoherent words for a solid 5 minutes. Eventually, she just walks away with no answer, but in the opposite direction of the stairs to her apartment. She shuffles her way out of sight from my peephole into the darkness. I hear her walk back upstairs, maybe an hour later. Strange. And fast forward to 3 a.m., and she's at our door again, knocking. To which, of course, she got no answer, but as I'm looking out the peephole, I can see her mumbling to herself as she knocks. She's definitely an older woman with dark gray hair and profound wrinkles on her face. Her hair is in disarray and her brow is furrowed, seemingly frustrated. She walks away like before, the opposite way of the stairs, and I didn't hear her go back up for a while, until she stomped her way up there, obviously very mad that no one is entertaining her 3 a.m. nonsense. My boyfriend went to his car to go to work Monday morning, and noticed a nail drove into the side of his tire. I'm not saying it was her who did this out of rage, or her unanswered knocks, but it was very convenient as he didn't drive all weekend, so there's no telling when it happened. He did, however, call our complex about the knocking and yelling at all hours of the night. It's Thursday, 1:46 a.m., almost a week later. Remember how I said my boyfriend normally sees her every morning on his way to work? He hasn't seen her once this entire week. Her car has sat in the same spot as well. Also, we haven't seen a single light from her apartment. Not when he gets home at 8 p.m., nor when I get home at 11 p.m. What has happened to this woman? I have no clue, but I'm just glad that the knocking has stopped. My experience isn't as exciting as some of these others, but I thought I would share it anyway. I had taken my 6-year-old daughter for a walk to the playground, and we had just moved houses, so I didn't know the area very well. I checked my Apple Maps to see if there was a quicker way home, as my little one was starting to complain a bit. The quickest way was through a graveyard. We started walking, and the birds were singing. It was quite sunny, perfectly normal. As we walked further through, the atmosphere just changed. It's really hard to explain, but it felt completely flat. No birds, no people, just a really oppressive feeling. We also noticed that some things looked not quite right, like gravestones facing in different directions. I've never seen this before, and it was bizarre. Some were in rows, some sideways, and some facing the opposite direction. And there was a huge pile of dirt against the side of the little church. I didn't want to scare my daughter, so I kept chatting. Then she seemed to notice it too, and said, "This is horrible. I don't like it here." I checked my map, and it had gone crazy and was directing us the opposite way, and kept changing and moving around. I followed the path around, and as the main street came into view, everything seemed to go back to normal. Birds, people, traffic sounds, even the sun seemed to get brighter. When we got home, we talked about it and told my husband. My daughter called it the creepy graveyard. The following week, we went back to show my husband, but it was like a different place. No weird vibes at all. It was very peaceful but completely normal, and we couldn't find the gravestones facing different ways. I read a book last week about time slips, and the way it felt was described by a few people who had experienced time slips. So I'm now wondering if this could be what happened to us.